All right, well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Boston Office 365 user group. Thank you for coming out today. My name is Dimitri. I'm one of the organizers. Alongside me is Bill Gunning and Dave Pileggi. We've been some of the OGs for the user group. It's actually crazy to think that this marks our 12-year anniversary of running the group.
That is crazy.
Yeah. Time really flies. So we'll follow our typical agenda where we'll begin with some updates for Microsoft 365 since we last met. That being said, for the previous session, if you were not able to come here and join us, James Restivo did a great presentation on before you build, getting process optimization right. This is on our YouTube channel for those that have missed it. So definitely come and check it out. So let's talk about some updates. So Microsoft has been named a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for document management for probably the 20th year in a row. Right. But what's more interesting is not to see that Microsoft is there, but to see how the landscape has shifted a bit and some of the other contenders are starting to drop down out of that leader quadrant. Big ones being OpenText in particular.
Yeah.
All right, there's a new feature coming to Copilot. And then all these features are either rolling out now or will be in the next month. But there's now an ability to declare authoritative sites in SharePoint for Copilot to use. The intent is that if you have highly curated information, whether it's on your intranet, it's a library or other areas, you can now set that as being authoritative using PowerShell for now. And then in doing so, Copilot will use that as a primary source over other sources. And additionally, if you do a typical search, you'll also get an additional visual indication that this was a recommended result from your organization. There's a new update coming for Outlook for Windows. So if you have a Copilot license, you're able to highlight text within a given email and ask for more information, and Copilot will help explain what that is and why that was being referenced. There's a new legal agent that is rolling out for Word. So this is intended for legal professionals to use, so they're not looking to replace lawyers at this stage, but they are looking to put tools in their hands that they could use. So the intent is that when reviewing a contract or other piece of document, they can take a look at the risks of this document compared to their known standards and templates and things that they've used in the past. And there's a new feature that is being released with Microsoft's multi-model approach. And as part of the Frontier program, if you're using the researcher agent, there's now the ability for it to use one model, such as OpenAI's model, to go through and come up with the response, and then use Anthropic's model to go and actually test that response and iterate on it and basically go back and forth and give you a better result at the end of the day. And if you see the chart here, Microsoft is comparing the results of researcher with critique, as they're calling it, to some of the other models that are out there, and it's scoring higher. So I would love to see how this multi-model thing evolves as we continue. There's also a new feature that's rolling out for visual storytelling with charts. A lot of times when we're designing intranet pages or other communications, we have a bunch of source content, but we don't necessarily have the time to go and make it look pretty. And nobody likes receiving a big spreadsheet in terms of just scrolling through and trying to catch up on what they missed. So Microsoft can now take grounding files and create graphs based on what it believes is important information in that file, along with full color coding and so forth. And that's pretty interesting. OneDrive for Windows is now upping its limit. So today you cannot sync more than 300,000 files. And even as you approach 300,000 files, it's going to start to get very slow and laggy. Microsoft has now increased that limit to 1 million.
Yay!
I don't have any information on this, but my gut feeling is that they must have improved some of the back-end functionality to enable this, which hopefully means that we'll all see a benefit even if we have less than 1 million files.
Is this in effect now?
This is all rolling out pretty soon. This one right now, you need to be enrolled in the public preview to take advantage of it, which is basically their beta program. And then once it becomes general available, my guess is that it'll be sometime this summer. There is an upgrade coming to SharePoint home sites. So it is no longer going to be called Viva Connections. It is now going to be called SharePoint.
Express.
So if you have Viva connections deployed inside of your tenant, your Teams icon will change from the Viva connections logo, which you have on the left here, into the SharePoint logo, which you see on the right. If you have a custom logo because you've overwritten it or you've uploaded your own package XML file, that will remain unchanged. This is a pretty cool feature, especially for those that are consultants. So for the longest time, if you had a mobile application management profile deployed to your phone, where your company that you're working with doesn't have full control over your phone, such as in an MDM scenario, but an MAM scenario where there's a secure container on your phone for corporate data, the challenge was that you couldn't have multiple different MAM accounts on the same device at the same time. Microsoft is starting to fix that problem, and now they're allowing you to have multiple different MAM accounts in place. So now I can have Outlook with 5 different companies or clients that each have their own MAM policies. For shared apps like Outlook, where you could be logged into multiple, it's going to take the most restrictive out of all of the accounts that you have loaded in there. So like if 1 out of the 5 in this example blocks copying text, that would apply to all of the Outlooks in there. Microsoft is also introducing a new feature to be able to test Teams microphone and speakers before joining a meeting. So if you have your typical meeting join screen here, there's a new link that appears underneath the computer audio. And if you click on it, it'll give you the ability to try to record something and then play it back. See if your headset is working correctly. Much overdue.
Yeah.
And the last update for today, Microsoft is retiring Together Mode in Teams.
Oh,
So unfortunately,
Gus is going to be so unhappy. But it was only ever used for that, probably.
yeah. All right. So thanks to our sponsor, which is the company I work for, Turn Digital. And now for the main event, we're going to introduce Rob Windsor to talk to us about identity management in Entra ID. Rob, over to you.
So as Dimitri mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the Microsoft Identity Platform, which is really it's mostly just Entra ID. So we're talking about like identity, the ability to authenticate with Microsoft services, set permissions around some of the APIs you want to expose or some of the APIs you want to use, and so on. So my contact info is here on the first slide. So email address and my Twitter handle. I still refuse to call it X. Also, so more social links here on this slide as well. In terms of like the content, the bottom link, so if you go to my GitHub, so github.com rob-windsor, and look at the repos that are available. There is a repo for this session, which you can find. So if I just come over here, just look for the RW Talk Identity Platform, and that's where you can get the slides that I'm going to be showing, as well as the demo code that I'm going to be using. So that's all available for you to download now. Again, there's the link there, github.com/rob-windsor/RW Talk Identity Platform. So basically, the identity platform is a combination of the Entra portal. So or you can actually use the Azure portal too to get the same information. But if you're specifically looking for Entra ID stuff, it's the Entra portal. There's a bunch of libraries, but the main one that Microsoft talks about when you look up identity platform is the Microsoft Authentication Library, commonly known as MSAL. We'll talk about other alternatives as well. But it's a cloud-based identity and access management service that gives you a single platform to handle both authentication and authorization across basically your entire M365 tenant, right? So the ability to have applications that can recognize who a user is and also say what that user can do in certain contexts, right? Other things are what identities does it support, right? So your tenant identity, so your work or school account can be used. Any personal identities, so personal accounts like Hotmail or Outlook, those kinds of accounts can use. be used as well, or you can use a combination of both of them. For business applications, generally you're using your tenant identity, your work or school account, but there are scenarios where using your personal accounts makes sense as well. And then in terms of authorization and authentication, you can do this with your own custom APIs, which is a very common scenario, or consuming the services that are available on from Microsoft. So things like Microsoft Graph or SharePoint, Outlook, email, that kind of stuff. You can use the identity platform for any of those. And it's all built on open standards. So there's nothing sort of Microsoft unique in terms of like what you're going to be doing. It's all based on the OAuth, OpenID Connect, and SAML standards. So I don't think anybody, I need to specify what a tenant is. Basically, if you have an organization that uses M365, you have a tenant. I think people are familiar with that. And same thing with a user, right? So we have individual users. Usually, when you use the term user in this context, it's generally talking about a human user. But we can also have non-human users, managed identities, right? So you can assign different permissions and allow these managed identities, and I'll talk more about those as we go on, to be able to perform actions as if they were a human user. One of the confusing parts of this process is the term application, because it's overloaded, right? So in the context of Entra ID, an application is really like an application registration. It's the thing that configures how you're going to, one, authenticate users and how you're going to assign permissions to them in the context of an application. Okay, so it's not like a client. It's not like I'm building a web app or I'm building a desktop app, because we will use that term for that context as well. But it's more like, just think of it as an application registration. All right, so that there's one of those that's unique across all tenants. And then along with an application registration is a service principal. So that's unique to an individual tenant. So for a single application registration, you can have multiple service principals if you're using multi-tenant authentication. Okay. So if you're just doing single tenant, then you will have the application registration, and then you'll have an associated service principal within your tenant.
Are they associated one-to-one or one-to-many?
It's one-to, well, if it's single tenant, then it's one-to-one, because it's only in your tenant. But if you're doing multi-tenant, then there's one application registration, and each tenant has its own service principal. Okay. Yeah, but for an application registration, there's only one application registration for like all tenants. Yeah, and it's you can identify it specifically by its GUID. So as I mentioned, Entra ID is the identity provider behind the identity platform, right? Authentication verifies who a user or a managed principal is, and then authorization determines what that individual or that entity can do. Okay, and as I mentioned previously, MSAL is the main library we use to do this, but there are multiple libraries available, which I'll talk about in just a second. All right, so to register an application, you can just go to the Azure portal and then click on Entra ID, or you can go directly to the Entra portal, right? Entra.microsoft.com, and set up an app registration. So one of the first things you have to decide is who can use this app registration. So single tenant is the most common, which basically like anybody within my tenant can use this app registration. And generally that's for like business applications, custom applications within your org, right? Multi-tenant is, it can be used by other tenants, your tenant and other tenants as well. And as I mentioned previously, you can also use personal accounts like Outlook.com, Hotmail, and that. Less of a business area. I'm not really going to cover that in detail over the course of this session. And I'll talk more about redirect URIs. All right, so when you're going through this process, there's a few components or the few parts of it that you need to be aware of. And let's actually go just take a look at the portal here. So if I just come over, I'm going to use a developer tenant that I have. So I'm here in the Entra portal, right? So again, just entra.microsoft.com. And then in the left-hand navigation, where we're going to be interested mostly is the app registrations, right? So registering an application. So let me just grab one I created while I was preparing this stuff. So I'll just go to all applications. And then here's one here. Okay, so in the overview section, the directory ID or tenant ID is one GUID you're going to be using. You can use the name as well. So in my case, it's Rob Windsor Test 980, which is sometimes more readable. So you can actually use that name as opposed to using the GUID. It's really up to you. Most of the demos I'm going to be doing use the GUID, right? So that identifies your tenant. And then we have the application or client ID, and that identifies the app registration, right? So because these are GUIDs, it's unique across all tenants. So that's where we hit, when we have the single app registration, that's how we identify it, right? Yeah.
So that application ID, you said that's unique to that tenant. So
no, it's unique across all tenants.
It's unique across all tenants.
Yeah, because it's a GUID, yeah. So there will never be two applications with the same application ID.
Okay. So is the tenant ID embedded in an application ID?
No,
Anywhere?
but during the authentication process, they're both used. But the tenant ID and the application ID are separate things.
Okay.
Question online, what do you mean when you say you can use the tenant instead of the ID GUID?
Oh, okay. So like all tenants have a name, right? So I have a bunch of tenants. I have robwindsor.com is a tenant name. I have robwindsor2 on microsoft.com. I have Rob Windsor Test 980. So you can use the text name, right? That you normally see it like in your SharePoint address, right? To identify a tenant, or you can use the GUID, right? You have the choice of doing it either way. In the demos I'm going to be showing, I'm going to be using the GUID, but you could use the tenant name. Okay, so in addition to the tenant ID and the client or application ID, another thing we need to define when we create an app registration is the redirect URIs or redirect URLs. So part of this process when we're doing the authentication and the authorization piece is the use of tokens, which I'll talk more about in just a second, right? So you have to say that this application registration can provide or give tokens to a set of redirect URLs, right? If you try to use the app registration and say, go send the tokens to some other URL that's not defined in the redirect URLs, it will give you an error. So you have to whitelist where this app registration can be used to be able to use it properly. And the redirect URLs will be different depending on the kind of client you have. So like, for example, the way you set it up for a desktop application or like a timer job is different than how you would do it for a web application. And there's areas within the app registration configuration that enable you to do that. Okay, so that's a very important piece of this as well. And then finally, another major component is permission requests. So when you define an app registration, you have to say if people are going to use this app registration, what permissions is it going to request for them? And there's a couple different kinds of permissions, right? And those permissions need to be consented by either the user or by an administrator, right? So it's going to say, oh, this application wants to, read your profile or read your basic information about your email or access your OneDrive or a bunch of different things, right? But either you or an administrator will be notified that those are the requests being made, and you have to say yes I consent to let this application do that. It's very much like, you know, when you install an app on your phone and it says, oh, it wants to use your camera or you would do whatever, right? And you have to say, yeah, that's okay. I'm going to be okay with it doing that, right? And if you say no, then this means you can't use that particular app registration.
Is this a bad practice? I usually use the redirect URI / URL empty because when it comes to my team, the interaction with the service principals are directly within the tenant for SharePoint, OneDrive, and things like that. Is that a bad practice?
So like if you're doing a front-end application where a user has to sign in, then you won't be able to do that, right? But if you're using managed or federated identities, then you can do that. Yeah, so it really depends on the situation that you're.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because when you said that, I'm like going
well,
through my
because
head.
in your scenario, the tokens are being used within M365 itself, right? They're not being.
Yeah.
So
correct.
so they're being exchanged internally. So it's basically saying by default, yeah, you can do this.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But because you're not sending it to like a browser, or you're not sending it outside of the tab.
No.
So that's fine to do.
Okay.
And actually, in some cases, that can be preferred. Again, really depending on context. The problem here is, you know, like I talked about, I could easily have 4 hours of material because there's so many, like, oh, in this situation do this, and in this situation do that. And obviously, in a talk like this, it's not possible to cover all the different scenarios. Yeah, but you absolutely can do that in that specific scenario. I'd say that's the lesser common scenario than what I see normally.
Yeah. So can I then throw a spin on that? And would that mean that because I don't have it, it actually locks it down further? It has a very small gap.
Yeah, because if I try to hit your app registration with Postman or on a web application, it would fail, right? It would say, no, I can't give you tokens.
So it's almost a more secure way of approaching it, if possible, in these very minor scenarios.
Well, I mean, in pretty much all scenarios, right? You don't want to have. It's like the least privileged. You know, you don't want to just say, "Oh, here's 18 redirect URIs you can use," when you don't actually need to do that. It's the same thing with permission requests, right? You can have very broad permission requests. Like, I want to read and write to all SharePoint sites in my entire tenant, right?
Yeah.
So but if I really only need access to 2 of them, why am I giving you permission to access all?
Right, that would be sites.selected, I believe.
That's one of the options to do site.selected in that particular scenario, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have a question online,
Sure.
Joel. What do you mean when you say you can use your name instead of the tenant ID GUID?
Oh, is that the same question?
Yes, that's the.
Yeah, yeah. So it's the text tenant name. So, you know, whatever if you did a custom domain, you can use the custom domain, or if you're just using the standard thing, it's like whatever the text name is, .onmicrosoft.com. So you can use that to identify the tenant.
I teach a lot of users, you can search by somebody's title or group name. You can also search by the GUID. Yeah, I always tell people that this quick way of finding out, did we delete the group or delete something and it got orphaned?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, just sometimes in code it's easier to put, or it's more obvious when you put the text name, right? When you're working in a single tenant scenario, it really doesn't matter because everybody knows it's our organization's tenant, so you don't really have to specify. But in a multi-tenant scenario, again, depending, right, it might be easier to use the text name, just because it's more obvious when you see it, right? Makes sense. Okay. So I was talking about permissions. Let's talk about the different permission types. So there's like a couple different combinations here. So one of them is static permission requests. These are defined with the app registration in the portal, right? And there's 2 types of permission requests you can use here. One is called delegated. So delegated means I'm requesting the permission on behalf of the user who's going to be using the application, right? So with delegated permissions, the user can do something if they have permission to do it and the app registration has been given permission to do it, right? So only in the union of those scenarios can you actually do something. So even if the user has permission to do something within SharePoint or OneDrive or whatever it is, if the app hasn't been granted that a similar permission, it can't do it, right? And the same thing, if the app has been granted permission to do something, but the user can't, they can't do it, right? So delegated is a union of the app permissions and the user permissions. There's also application permissions, which are generally used for scenarios where there is no actual user, like a web service or a timer job or so on. Not always the case, but generally that's the case. Or you want to elevate permissions. Where in that scenario, if the application registration has been requested a permission and that permission has been granted, then it can do what you've granted permissions this. So if there is a user, which there in many scenarios isn't in this with application permissions, it doesn't matter what the user permissions are. The application can do it. Okay. So in the delegated scenario, generally, you're going to have the user consent permissions. You can have an administrator consent the permission for all users. So if you're an administrator, you can say, I don't want my users being shown the consent dialog, which I'll show you a little bit later on. So I'm just going to grant the permission for everybody, right? So in the delegated scenario, it could be the user, it could be an admin. In the application scenario, application permissions, only an admin can grant those permissions. And quite often that's actually done in the Entra portal. There is a URL you can navigate to see the consent dialog in the admin scenario, but generally that's done right in the portal, and I'll show you where you can do that. Okay. There are some delegated permissions, generally the broader ones, that an admin has to consent rather than the individual user. It's not the common scenario, but there are cases where that is what happens. And then when you authenticate and you get tokens, and I'll talk more about tokens in just a second, the permissions that have been granted in the app are included or described in the tokens that you'll end up using. Okay, so here's a screenshot. Let's go back to the portal. Right, so in an app registration, one of the left-hand nav in the app registration itself is API permissions. Okay, so you can click on that, and then you can see what permissions have been requested so far. So we have the delegated sites.readall, so for the user, application also sites.readall, and then user.read, right? And I can go in and say add a permission, and here you can see the APIs that Microsoft provides, right? So obviously Microsoft Graph, they're encouraging you to use that because it's giant and it's at the top, right? But you know, you can see there's lots of other different APIs that Microsoft provides in M365, like one of them, for example, is SharePoint. So if you want to use the SharePoint Client Object Model or REST API, you can go click here, okay? So for each of them, when you click on it, you'll see the option to use either delegated permissions or application permissions. And then when you choose one of these, you'll then have a set of scopes. So each one of these is called a permission scope, and it defines a set of permissions, right? So we talked about with SharePoint sites. Let's take a look at that one. So if I just come in here and I just search for sites, we can see, so sites create all. This is actually a relatively new one. It's an interesting permission where it allows you to create a site, really a site collection. But once you've done that, you don't have permissions on the site. So it's a provisioning permission, which doesn't allow you to do too much. It's not like sites.readWriteAll. You can create a new site, but then you have to assign a user as the admin, and then that user can then go and do stuff within that site collection. So that's a relatively new one. Sites full control all, sites manage all. These are like admin level permissions. Like basically can do most stuff within the site. Read, write all, and sites not selected, which Dave mentioned it a little bit ago, where you can say, you have another application registration which says, here is the permission to use this permission, which is kind of interesting. And then this permission, you can say, all right, I'll give you access to a named set of site collections within SharePoint, right? And you know, if I remove that search, right, you can see that there are lots and lots and lots of sets of permission scopes that you can end up using, and trying to. It's sometimes not super discoverable what all of them are. So you're going to be using documentation and searches and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So I have like one application. It's a fax software, and
fax. Sorry, fax or fax?
Fax.
CT or X?
Copax.
Oh, Colfax, yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
Actual old school fax.
Okay.
So
all right. That's why I was asking. Go. Yeah.
So users go and they can review them, and then they want to save them to their SharePoint sites.
Okay.
And they want to be able to only save them to sites where they can write to. Because what's happening is they're seeing all the intranet sites that they have read access to. Is there a permission that you can read and write, but only scope to sites that you have edit permission?
Yeah, so you can make a call to see what sites do I have access to, and then you can go make additional calls to see what permissions do I have within that site.
So the vendor has to make those changes. There's no like out of the box graph permission that would just show you those sites.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
So it's a vendor issue.
Yeah, it's, again, I always hate to say absolutes because again, something like the sites created, that's a relatively new permission, and these things often just show up, and it's like, then you have to go do some investigation if you didn't know already that.
I didn't know if there was a way of me tweaking the graph permissions to do that. Yeah.
No, I'm not aware of a single way to do it without doing multiple calls. With multiple calls, you can absolutely do it. And on the SharePoint side, OneDrive, it's a little bit different, but on the SharePoint side, when you talk about permissions, there's two kinds of permissions, right? There's the permission groups permissions, but there's also the SharePoint custom permission groups, and Microsoft Graph only does one of them, right? So you have to fall back to the SharePoint client object model if you want to check the SharePoint custom permission groups that have been around for forever. Yeah, because Graph doesn't support it.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Any other questions on the scope stuff? Okay. So again, yeah.
We do have one more question online. Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Could you give an example of a scenario where both delegated and application permissions would be given for the same permission type in the same app?
I'll talk about that towards the end of the talk. So I'll get there. Okay, so these are static permission requests. The alternative is dynamic permission requests. So these only can be used when you're talking about delegated permissions. They can't be used with application permissions. And instead of defining the permission request in code, or sorry, in the portal, you instead define them in code. So at the point you're going to go authenticate with Entra ID and ask for tokens, then you can say these are the permissions that I'm requesting, right? And one of the things you can do with dynamic permission requests, which you can't do with static permission requests, is at the beginning of the app, like let's say you have a portal, a web portal that does a whole bunch of stuff within your tenant, right? And one of the things it can do is write files to your OneDrive, but that's an uncommon scenario. So at the beginning, you can only request the permissions that people generally need. And then at the point where you're going to need the permission to write to the OneDrive, then you can say, oh, now can you add on the permission to write to OneDrive on top of what I've already got, right? So it allows you to not get every single permission you need right off the bat when you only need some of those permissions on a very, very rare basis, right? So that's an advantage of dynamic permission request. But again, it only works when you're talking about delegated permissions. It doesn't work when you're talking about application permissions. Okay, so I've talked about tokens a lot, right? So there's a few different tokens. They're all in the JSON web token format, or JOTS, right? And there's actually a couple sites. One common one is jwt.ms, but there's other ones as well, where when you have tokens and you want to see the innards or the decoded version of the token, you can go and pass it off to the website, and the website will show it to you in JSON format, so you can easily see what's going on. And from a debugging standpoint, that's quite often valuable. So one of the tokens is an ID token. And really, this is just about, I want to get basic information about the user without having to like make a graph call to get their full user profile. Okay, so ID tokens are really about getting identity and profile information for a user. They're not about authorization and authentication. Okay, so for example, if I want to have a user log into a website, again, instead of making a graph call to go to get their profile, I can ask for an ID token, and I can use that to populate, you know, their avatar in the top right and all that kind of stuff, right? So again, really just about getting basic profile information about the user when you go to authenticate. Access tokens are the tokens that have the most value in this process, right? So basically, after you've authenticated, or after the application has authenticated, right? Because sometimes there's no actual user, right? Then you're going to get back at least an access token. And then when you want to consume protected resources, like calling the Microsoft Graph or calling the SharePoint Client Object Model, or whatever it happens to be, you attach the access token to the request. And then the API can say, oh yeah, you're a valid user and you've been given permissions to do the things you've asked me to do, right? So that's how it knows that yes, I've authenticated, and yes, I've been granted permissions to perform certain actions, right? Is by attaching this access token to the request to the protected resource. Okay. Access tokens generally have a short lifespan, like an hour-ish kind of thing. But some of what are called authentication flows, or some of the ways you can authenticate in applications, you can also get what's called a refresh token, which is usually long-lived, right? And then what you can do is, if your access token is expired, you can use the refresh token to go get a new access token refresh token pair. So you can do that silently without user interaction, right? So that's why when you create a Power Automate flow and it asks you to authenticate to use some connector, that it's not constantly prompting you to re-authenticate, because it has the refresh token and it's constantly using the refresh token to go get a new access token refresh token pair so it can continue to work. Okay. Again, access tokens is what we send with requests to protected resources, and refresh tokens, if we get them, we don't always get them, we can use to then silently go get a new access token along with the new refresh token. Okay, so really what you're trying to do is, as much as possible, authenticate without having the user to get involved in the process through the use of these tokens. All right, so I talked about the Microsoft Authentication Library, or MSAL. So when you look at the Microsoft Identity Platform documentation, MSAL is the library it talks about the most. It's a general OAuth authentication library, right? So you can use MSAL with Entra ID, but you can also use it with other providers if they support the OAuth standards, which most like identity providers do. It's not super complicated to use, but in certain scenarios, there are libraries that could be better that you might think about using. I'm going to use MSAL during the demos, but you can absolutely use these other libraries, right? So one of them is the Azure Identity Library. It's really good when you're specifically using Azure services, right? Like Azure Key Vault or Blob Storage, these kinds of things, right? And then the Microsoft Identity Web is specifically designed for ASP.NET Web applications, right? So again, it wraps MSAL, but it just makes it easier to use MSAL when you're specifically using a web application, right? So depending on context, you might use other libraries instead of MSAL or with MSAL, right? You might end up using both. So there's various flavors of the Microsoft Authentication Library, or MSAL, right? So there's a .NET one, JavaScript, TypeScript, Python, Java. You can see the list there, right? So depending on what kind of application you're building, there are different flavors of MSAL that you can use. And in many cases, they work similarly. In some cases, they work a little bit different. So there's a MSAL browser that doesn't really match the way that other variants of MSAL work, but for the most part, they try to be consistent so that if you're familiar with one, you can end up using the other. Okay. So there's two application types within MSAL. Public applications are basically used when there's a user present and there are no secrets involved. And then confidential applications, and the reason they're called confidential is because secrets are involved during the authentication process. I just wanted to mention that. We'll see this in the code demos. It's not super important to really grasp that right yet, but it is important. It will become important a little bit later on during the talk. Okay, another thing that's valuable with MSAL is there's a built-in token cache for you. So there's if you're just using standard HTTP requests to do the authentication and the authorization, then you're responsible for caching the tokens, whereas MSAL will do some of that for you, right? And I mentioned it here. I think I mentioned it elsewhere in the deck too, but it is an important note. The couple bullets at the bottom there. When you're doing authentication, you always want to try to authenticate silently first, right? So do I have a cached access token? Is that access token expired? If it's not, I just use it, I'm done, right? If the access token is expired, do I have a refresh token? If I do, then I want to try to use the refresh token to go get a new access token. And if I do, then I'll use that, right? And it's only when both of those things fail or you don't have a refresh token and you have an expired access token that you then get the user involved and make them do something, okay? So that's a really, really important strategy that you just need to think about when you're applying this stuff. So I talked about the Azure Identity Library. So the big advantage here is the use of the default Azure credential, okay? So the idea here is that you can write one set of code that will work when you're running locally, when you're working in your dev environment, when you're working in your QA environment, when you're working in your prod environment, right? It knows, it goes through this chain of how am I going to authenticate, right? And that chain works in all those different scenarios. So it knows, oh, when I'm running locally, well, have I used the Azure CLI to log in, like AZE login, right? Or have I logged in VS Code or whatever? So does it know who I am? Oh, if it does, then it can use that credential to do stuff, right? But when it's running in hosted mode, it's like, oh, there's a managed identity that I know about and it's been given permissions that I need. I'll use that, right? So it can use different identities in different scenarios to authenticate and perform actions, reducing the amount of additional code that you have to write as a developer. Okay, and again, this is specific to working with Azure stuff, right? So Key Vault, blob storage, queuing, that kind of stuff, right? When you were talking about working with the default credential. So in those scenarios, this is a really, really nice library. It can really reduce the amount of code you write, and especially when you're working with things like managed identities or federated identities. Okay. All right. So let's talk about authentication flows. So depending on the kind of application you've written, now in this case, when I say application, I'm talking about stuff you wrote code for, right? I'm not talking about an application registration, right? So depending on the kind of application you've written, you'll have different options in what's the flow or the process that you use to authenticate, get tokens, and then go call these protected resources. Okay, so the standard ones are the authorization code or auth code flow. There's a couple different variants of it, right? So this is client-facing application or user-facing application. So generally it's web apps, could be a mobile app, it could be a desktop app, right? But there is a user involved in this flow. Okay? There's a variant called the authorization code flow with PKCE, which I'll talk more about in upcoming. When you use this flow, you can get ID, access, and refresh tokens, right? So you have access to all the different tokens I mentioned in the previous slides. Another commonly used flow is called the client credentials flow. So this is generally used where there isn't a user involved, right? So I'm in a web service, I'm in a timer job, some kind of daemon process, right? So in this case, the only token we can get is an access token. We can't get the other two types of tokens. I'm just going to mention device code flow here for completeness. I'm not going to talk about it later on in the deck, but I just want to mention it. If you're in a place where you need the user to interact, but it's not easy to do so, like on a TV, right? So I'm writing an app for my TV, right? We can use the device code flow where the TV will say, oh, go to this URL and type in this code, right? And then it'll basically sit there and poll and wait till the user does that, and then I'll go, oh, okay, now I got the thing I need to go and complete the authentication process. Okay, it's not super commonly used unless you're doing like IoT and that kind of stuff, but it is there, and I just didn't want to mention it for completeness, but I'm not going to talk about it really much beyond that. And then the final commonly used flow is the on behalf of flow. Okay, so this is a scenario where, again, you have like a web service or timer job that there is no logged in user, but you end up needing to do something on behalf of a user, right? This is super common in APIs, right? So you're building a custom API with it for your organization or for an application to say, oh, I want this API to go and like put a file into a user's OneDrive, right? So it's going to use a mechanism, which I'll talk about in a little bit, to go and take a token that the user used when they first logged in to the application and exchange that for a new token that has access to resources that the user didn't originally have access to.
Question.
Yeah.
How does it, so the on behalf of, is that like a static connection, or does that use like a lookup, or does it have the option to use a lookup? Like for example, a lookup would be users manager.
So you can use this technique to go find an individual user manager, yes.
Yeah.
Can you act as the user's manager? No.
Okay.
Right. The only way you can act as the user's manager if their manager logged in like somewhere and got a token for themselves, right? Because you're acting on behalf of the user who already authenticated through another process. Let me get to there, and then maybe if you have a follow up or.
So what I was getting at is whether or not the on behalf of had a mechanism for validating that the user has the rights to act on behalf of the other.
Yeah, so in the on behalf of flow, we're using delegated permissions, right? So the user has to have permissions to perform the action that you're asking to do, right? Yes, I have a slide on this. Let me get to that point, and then if you still have questions, I'd be happy to, but I might provide more context.
That'd be great, thank you.
Okay, so let's talk about the authorization code. So there's a couple of things I want you to keep in mind as I go through these slides, right? Everything I'm showing you can be done with just HTTP requests, right? So you can go to Entra and say, I want to do this process, and here's a GET request to do this thing, and then you're going to give me this piece of information. I'm going to do a POST request to do the thing, right? You absolutely can do that. But if you look at these libraries like MSAL and so on, they have tons and tons of like verification, caching, all this other stuff that they're doing on top of this, that if you just make the HTTP request, you would need to do, okay? So I'm not saying that you should use the HTTP requests, but you should understand that they're being used during the process that MSAL or the Azure Identity Library is doing, okay? So understanding what's going on behind the scenes is important. Actually doing it is less important, but you should just be aware. And the Microsoft Learn documentation on this stuff is really, really good. Also the Auth0 site, because again, they're all based on the same standards, right? So if you just go, do a search in your favorite search engine or ask your favorite AI assistant, tell me about the authorization code flow. It will show you the stuff. And actually in the README files and some of the demos I have like the whole flow charted out. So you can walk through it. But basically with the authorization code flow, it's a two-step process. So the first thing is you make a GET request to Entra, right? And in that GET request, you include the ID of the app registration that you've made in the Azure portal, okay? So what it'll do is it'll say, okay, is the user who just made this GET request, from a web application, are they already logged in to the tenant? If they aren't, it'll ask them to log in, right? If this is the first time the user has tried to use this application registration, then it will show them a dialog that tells them about the application registration that they're trying to use and the permissions it's requesting. And the user will have to say, yes, I consent to these permission requests. Once you've done that once, you don't have to do it again. But you have to do it at least once, or an admin has to do it on your behalf, okay? So after they've authenticated with Microsoft and after they've consented the permissions, then I forgot to mention, in the GET request, you also have to identify the redirect URL you want the authorization code to be sent to, right? So it'll redirect to the redirect URL you gave it, and on the query string will be what's called an authorization code, okay? Authorization code can't be used for like API calls and that kind of stuff. But what you can do is you can exchange the authorization code for an access token and a refresh token. Okay, so then you take the code that was given to you in the redirect and you exchange it for the token pairs by making a POST request, which includes, depending on if you're using PKC or not, the client ID, the client secret, the redirect URL, and the authorization code that you were just given. Okay, and then the identity provider, in this case Entra ID, will give you back the access token, refresh token pair. Okay, so again, it's a two-step process that you need to go through to be able to do this. Okay, now let's take a look at an example of doing this using just the HTTP requests. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my Azure portal, right? Sorry, my Entra portal. I said Azure portal, but I meant Entra portal. And I'm going to go to app registrations. And let's create a new app registration, right? So what's the name? Let's say BOS 365 auth code. Okay. Who do I want to be able to use this? Is it just my tenant? Is it multiple tenants? Can I use my personal accounts for this? In this case, I'm just going to do single tenant. Okay, and I should mention, let me just open up the sample, right? So again, this is available in the downloads that I mentioned in my Git repository. So let's take a look at the README file, actually. Let's close that. And let's preview the review. So these instructions are all located in the README file, right? So I'm going to go create a new registration. For the redirect URI, so this URL is basically defined within the code, right? So it's localhost 3000 when you're running locally, right? So I'm going to come back to here. In the redirect URI, actually, I'll show you a different way to do this. But what I would do here is just drop this down, say web, and then put that value in there. But I want to show you another way to do the same thing because it enlightens some other parts of the discussion. Okay, so I'm going to click register. And as I showed earlier, you're going to have your directory ID. So for every single application registration I have, this directory ID is always the same because it's my tenant that I'm defining this thing in, right? So let me just grab that. Oh, I actually probably have this pre-populated. Yeah, so there's my tenant ID, okay? I also need a client ID. So let's go back to here. The client ID is this ID, right? So the application ID and client ID, they're synonymous. So we'll grab that. We'll come over here and we'll paste it in here. Oops, let's try that again. Okay. Oops. All right. So grab the application and tenant ID, go to certificates and secrets and create a new client secret. Okay. So part of the authentication process, not always, but in many scenarios, includes the use of secrets. Okay. So a secret is just a random string that both your application and Entra are aware of. Instead of using a secret, you can also use a certificate, right? Certificates are more secure. It's a little bit more code. So for the demo purposes, it's not really great. But in production scenarios, it's recommended that you use certificates instead of secrets if you can. So I'll just go and say, create a new client secret here. We'll just say this is for a test client. I'll just use the recommended lifetime. And oops, how do I, let's see here. Just need to move that so I can say add. And then once you've created the client secret, its value will be shown to you until you navigate off of this page. Okay, so you have to copy it immediately or you won't be able to see it. If you happen to move away and you didn't copy it, just create a new one. Delete the one you created and create a brand new one. It's not a big deal. So I'll come back here and I'll replace the client secret that I had. The redirect URL and the session secret are fine. I can just leave those to the values of what it's currently using. Yeah.
So when you create that secret, it also creates a secret ID. Is that used for anything in the authentication?
Like if you're programmatically accessing the secrets and you want to identify it, then you can do it through the secret ID. From like a day-to-day use, no.
Got it.
Yeah, it's really only for home. All right, so let's go over here. Right. So as I mentioned, there are two pieces to this. There is making the request to what's called the authorization endpoint. Okay. So the original request goes to the authorization endpoint that's here to get request. Right. So it includes the client ID. So it identifies the app registration you're trying to use. The response type is code, saying that I want to get an authorization code back. You need to specify the redirect URI, because again, you can have multiple redirect URIs, and sorry, I forgot to do that. I said I was going to do it, and I didn't do it. So let me come back to here. Here. Grab this redirect URI. And I could have done that on the initial page that I showed you, or I can do that by going to authentication, saying add redirect URI, and then it's going to say what kind of application are you using, because the way that this gets configured is different or can be different depending on the kind of application that you're using. Well, this is a web application, so I'll choose web, and then I'll paste the redirect URI into here. Okay. There's a bunch of other things, like for example, do I want an ID token? Do I want to be able to log out? That kind of stuff. In this particular case, I'm not going to do that, but again, depending on the kind of client application that you're going to use this from, there's different options in those dialogues. So that's why I wanted to show you it there. And then you can see down here, and again, the sharing thing is blocking this a bit, but you can see. Let's see if I can read size this. I'm trying to, but it's not. Anyway, there's a web drop down here, and then you can see the actual redirect URI is shown there. So this is allowed to send tokens to that particular URL.
You can hide.
Oh,
like
yeah,
right
thank you.
there.
I didn't even see that. Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, no worries.
So there you go. Okay, so you've got everything back to the README. Yeah, I did all the stuff. Okay, so let's just come over to the application. It's a Node application, so I've already done the npm install. I don't need to do anything there. So now I can just say npm start. Start the application. It's going to listen for requests at localhost 3000. So then I'm just going to go to a user in my tenant. This is a dev tenant, so this is a sample user called Alex Wilbur. So I'll navigate there, right? It's going to ask me to log in. So this is going to send the GET request to the authorization endpoint, right? So this is a well-known endpoint. If you're using another identity provider, it will tell you what the authorization URL is. So it's going to send a GET request with that information that I talked about. So I'll click login. Okay, so I've already logged in. So it, M365 knows who I am, so it didn't ask me to do the login process. But now it's showing me, again, what we call the consent dialog, right? So it tells me who it's identified me as, what the name of the application registration is, and the permissions that it's requesting. And you can you can expand those to show additional information, right? And I need to say, yes, I accept, or no, I don't, right? And if I was an admin, there would be an addition, there would be a checkbox here saying consent on behalf of all users. So you can do that if you want to. This particular user is not an admin, so they can't do that. So I'm gonna click accept. Okay, so there is the token that is given back to me. So the result of this was that it sent, now this kind of happened really quickly, so you couldn't see it. You know what, maybe let me just do it this way, and then you should be able to see it. Okay, so let's do F12, and let's put this at the bottom, and let's go to network. Okay, so log in with Microsoft. Okay, so there is the request to the authorize endpoint, right? So you can see here it's login.microsoftonline.com, the tenant ID /OAuth2/v2/authorize. So that's the authorization endpoint. The client ID is the ID of the app registration. I'm asking for an authorization code, and here's the redirect URI to the callback page. Oh, and optionally, you can put the permission scopes requested as well. That's not always required, but you can do that. Okay. So then it's going to make a request to the callback page. So this is the redirect URI that I just gave it, right? Localhost 3000 callback, and then here's the authorization code. So I'm going to take, my code is going to take that authorization code and make a request, a post request to the token endpoint, to then go and exchange that authorization code for the token pairs. Okay, so if I come back to my server, that's this code down here, right? So there's the token endpoint with the tenant ID. I'm making a post request. I'm going to say that I'm going to give you an authorization code, and here's the code itself, right? And it was given to this redirect URI, and here's the client ID and client secret, and I want now you to give me the tokens back, right? So this is how all this stuff is done, just using the HTTP requests. Okay. Now, if I take that token, right? So the access token is written out here. It's encoded, but I can go to a site like jwt.ms, and then I can paste this token in, and I can see the decoded version of it, right? So who was the issuer of this token? Depending on whether you're using a V, there's two different types. There's a version 1 and a version 2 token. This happens to be a version 1 token. You can see that it's sts.windows.net and then the tenant ID. If it was a V2 token, it would be login.microsoft.com, the tenant ID, and then /V2. But it would basically be the same thing, right? So who validated, right? Who's the issuer of this token, right? The app display name, so what's the name of the app? What's the app ID or the client ID? Some information about the user itself, right? So again, when you're debugging this stuff, having access to decoded tokens, like what's the scopes that are granted and so on, can be very valuable, right? In determining why did this authentication fail, or why when I try to call the protected resources it failing or whatever, right? So again, the gwt.ms is one of several sites you can use to view decoded tokens. But now that I have the token, I can go and make a call to a protected resource. So if I come back over to my app registration, by default, every single app requests the user.read permission. Okay, so that was one of the things that I granted. So now this application can go make a call to the Microsoft Graph to get my profile. Right now, is it common for us to grant API permissions like that to a front-end application? No, this is a demo, right? But I just wanted to show you that once you have a token, you can go ahead and use it to make a call to a protected resource, right? So when I make that call, I attach in the authorization header the access token. So that's how Microsoft Graph knows who I am and what I can do, okay? If I didn't attach the access token in the authorization header, I would have gotten a 401 error saying you're not authorized to do this, okay? So that's doing this all with HTTP requests, which again, you should understand, but I wouldn't recommend doing it on a day-to-day practice. What happens if we want to use MSAL to do this, which is, I would say, more of a recommended practice, right? So let's go take a look at that. So I'll come back over here, stop this. All right, so if we take a look at my package JSON, right, you can see that one of the dependencies is at Azure MSAL node, okay? So I'm using the node version of MSAL, right? Again, if this was a C# application, it would be the .NET version. It would be a NuGet package. It wouldn't be an NPM package, but same idea, right? And I'm just using Express for handling requests to URLs in this application. Right, so if I come over to server.js, basically we can see the same thing that we saw before. So let's find the right place. Where is it defining the PCA? Okay, here we go. All right, so I talked about the different types we can use to represent an application within MSAL, right? So there's the confidential client application and there's public client application, right? So this is, we're using the confidential client application, right? So we're creating a new object of that. The client ID identifies the app registration, the authority, so this defines my tenant. Again, for the tenant ID, I could use the GUID, or I could have said robwindsortest.980.onmicrosoft.com. as a tenant ID. That would have worked just fine too. Okay, and then the client secret. So since a secret is involved, we need to use the client, a confidential client application anytime a secret's involved. That's part of that process, right? And then down here, where we go to authenticate, we use that application object to get the authorization code URL. We attach the scopes and the redirect URI to that, and then we make a GET request to that auth URL, right? So now we're having the library do that work for us instead of us, using Fetch or Axios or some other tool to to go and do that. Okay? And then the same thing on the callback, right? When we're given the authorization code, we want to exchange it for the access token, we're going to call the acquired token by code method, right? So we're given the authorization code here, and we're going to exchange that for the token pair, right? So in this case, we're letting the library do all that work, but it's also doing stuff like token caching. In some cases, it's doing token validation, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. It's doing other stuff for you so that you don't have to worry about doing it yourself, right? And that's really the value of these libraries, right? But as you can see, the experience is basically the same, right? So let me just come over to here, grab the end file that I used in the previous demo, come over here and just paste it over top of the existing file. So we have the same configuration, right? And then come back over here and do npm start. Okay, and then come back over to here and just refresh, right as Alex Wilbur. Log in with Microsoft. Okay, that didn't work. That's not what I expected. Okay, oops, back over to here. Yeah. Oh, is it asking for different? I might have different information. So 7839. 7839. Okay, hold on. Let me just grab this. Client secret redirect URI. I think it's the same information that I just typed in. Tenant ID, client secret. Redirect URI is the same, localhost 3000 callback. Interesting. At least one demo has to fail every time you present it for a meeting, right?
Absolutely, that's the rules.
Okay. Okay, let me just try this.
You're doing great. You got this far and only one.
Which one will fail as a secret?
Yeah. Okay. So let's just see if it's the application or if it's there's some caching going on. So let me come back over to here. Do that. Oh yeah, you know what? It's the token. So the logout doesn't clear the token cache. That's why, because it already had a cache token for the yeah. So that's why. So you can see now. Here's permission request. Now I am an admin, so this is my account, not a sample user. So you can see the consent on behalf of your organization.
Yep.
How do you know there it's delegated or not? Like, or you can open it up and see?
Well, if it's being shown to a user, it has to be delegated.
Oh, okay.
Right. There's an admin endpoint you can do to get to the same thing, but in terms of like the authorization code flow, it's delegated. Authorization code flow only works with delegated permissions because a user is part of the consent process.
Yeah, because I had some nervous admins that are like, oh, am I doing this delegated or not?
No, only if it's admin permissions, only an admin can ever see them. A non-admin user will never be able to see them. Yeah. They won't have permissions to do that. Okay. So, but now I want to. It's going to bug me if I don't. Okay, hold on.
Yeah, you'll have to clear this cache.
Yeah. So let's do that, and then let's go to here. Let's go to application and storage and clear site data. All right, now let's log in. Oh, Newman. All right, never mind. But okay, you get the idea, right? It worked in the other one. But the idea here is that we're using the. I'm going to be up until like all hours of the night trying to figure out why didn't this work. But you can see it's using the AP or the library rather than just doing the standard HTTP request. Okay, so any additional questions on that at all? Okay, so that's the authorization code flow. Again, it's used in user-facing applications. A user is involved in the authentication process, right? So when you go to authenticate, it's always going to be the user authenticating to get the authorization code.
You got a question online?
Sure.
If I modify the API permission later, would the application still be able to use the existing refresh token?
No, because as you saw, use the existing refresh token. That's an actual interesting question.
Yeah, if you make a change, yeah.
Because you're getting a new access token. You definitely won't be able to use that permission in an existing access token because you can see that the scopes that have been granted are part of the access token. If you use the refresh token to get a new access token, would that work? Honestly, I don't know off the top of my head whether it would or not. That was something you have to.
That's wild, because you would have to have an actual engaged token, have the change happen, and then have the refresh actually get triggered.
Yeah, so
isn't there an association between the refresh and the actual token though? So
there's definitely an association, right? But you're going through the authentication, like you're going to the server and saying, here's the refresh token, give me a new access token. So will that new access token have that new permission or not? And honestly, I don't think I've ever tried that, so I honestly don't know. My gut tells me it should fail, right? Because the refresh token was given to you when the permission sets were different.
But
I can't say for sure that it will fail. I'd have to try it.
Yeah, no, it depends on how they programmed it.
Yeah. But you definitely couldn't use that access token to use that permission, like the existing access token. You'd have to get a new one.
Okay.
Whether you actually do it through a full authentication process or whether you do it through the use of a refresh token. All right, so there's a variant of the authorization code flow, which is called the authorization code flow with PKCE, or proof key for code exchange. Okay. So before, I don't know how long ago it got deprecated. I'm going to say like a couple years ago. That's top of my head. There was a flow called the implicit flow. So web applications would use this, but the token, the access token, would be given and shown on the query string, right? So it was like super unsecure. So Microsoft came up with this concept of, instead of using the implicit flow, we're going to use the authorization code flow with PKCE. So it works exactly the same as the flow I just showed you, with two exceptions. When you go to authenticate, the caller is responsible for creating what's called a code verifier, which is just some random long string. Okay, and then the code challenge, which is a hash of that long string. Okay, so when you go to get an authorization code, you include on the query string the code challenge, right, the hash, and the mechanism you use to create the hash. Usually it's S265, 256, 265, whatever, one of those two. I just off the top of my head, it's like and then when you go to exchange the authorization code for a token pair, then you include the code verifier. And in most scenarios, if you use this mechanism, you don't need to include the client secret in the second call. Not all identity providers are the same. With Entra ID, you don't, right? So that's another value there. The code verifier takes the place of the client secret. But it's really just additional stuff on top of using the authorization code flow. If you can do the authorization code flow with PKC, it's recommended because it's more secure. Okay, but other than those two little things that I just talked about, it's exactly the same process, right? So there's a two-step process. You do the GET request, you get the authorization code, and then you exchange the authorization code for access token, refresh token pair. And again, all users always involved here. It's only delegated permissions, all that same stuff. Okay, so a very commonly used one, so auth code flow is very commonly used. Client credentials flow is also very commonly used. So in this case, we're talking about a scenario where there normally isn't a user. There could be, but the user doesn't really matter, okay? So in this case, the application is acting, when I say application here, I'm talking about the application registration, is acting on behalf of itself. right? So the application registration can ask for certain permissions. Only an admin can say, yes, I'm going to grant those permissions. And then the application uses either a client ID and client secret or a client ID and certificate. And in this scenario, the secret or the certificate effectively becomes the password for the application. Okay, so that's how it's authenticating with Entra ID, and that's how it's going to get its access level. Okay, it's a very simple process. I have an example that uses MSAL to do this. So let me just show you that. I'm not going to. Yeah, we're running a little short on time, so let me just show you the code. This code is available for you to download. All right, so again, there's a README file which describes this whole process. So when you go download this, the README file walks you through the entire process, how the flow works, what prerequisites it's using. So this is a C# application rather than a Node application, how to register the app, all that kind of stuff, right? So if we go to app settings, did I not? Hold on, which folder am I in here? Yeah, okay. So we need a tenant ID, a client ID, and a client secret. So let's go over to here. We'll go to app registrations. I'm going to go to all applications and filter on created on, so I can see the ones I created and client credentials demo. So what's the app ID or the client ID? Let's copy that, come over here, client ID. What's the tenant ID? Come over here, tenant ID, grab that, paste it in there. What's the client secret? Oh, okay, in this case, we don't, so one of the advantages of using .NET, and maybe this actually got put in the secret store and that's why it's empty, but I can't remember for sure, is we don't actually have to put the client secret right in our application. We can use this user secrets feature that .NET provides to go and set that. So let's just go grab this and put that onto here. And then if I didn't copy down the client secret, I won't be able to get it. So I'll come in here, I'll create a new client secret. Oh, hold on. Oh yeah, you can see the start of the value, but not the actual value itself. So I'll say new client secret, again, test client 2, click add, and then I'll grab the one that I can copy to the clipboard. I'll come back over here and I'll paste that in there. Okay, so it's got set to my secret store. So now that I have that, so take a look at our app settings. It's not there, but it is on my machine. It's available to me on my machine. So now I should be able to go ahead and run the application. So it's .NET Run.
Rob, while this is compiling, so quick question. I know you're using the REST calls to get the tokens and exchange them and everything. So what is the MSAL library doing in this case? Or are you bypassing it to show how it works?
So the very first demo, I did the HTTP request. The second demo I did was the same thing, but using MSAL library. This example is using the MSAL library as well, right? So MSAL, like again, it does, depending on what kind of application, it does like all the token caching, it does token verification, It does a whole bunch of stuff for you. It does error, like all the error handling. It does tons and tons of stuff. Right? So I only showed you the HTTP request example to let you know that this is what's going on behind the scenes and that you should be aware of that. But I would never recommend that you use that process in a production application. Okay, so in this case, it's just showing you the token, but again, it just went through the client credentials flow. Well, it used MSAL to do that, right? So again, we have a confidential client application builder. So we're doing a confidential client. There's the client ID, right? The client secret. So it read that out of the secret store rather than my end file. So it's not showing up. What's the authority? So it's again identifying my tenant as the authority. And what scopes? So notice the use of .default here. When you're doing static permission requests, you use the .default scope, which means go to the Entra portal and look there to see what permissions I've requested. I'm not going to tell you in the code. And the other example with the delegated permissions, we actually had those permission requests in the permission scopes, sorry, defined in the code rather than in the portal itself. Dave.
Just out of curiosity, did you write the client secret store, or is that something that's built into Azure and I just never stumbled over?
Built into the .NET. Yeah.
Of course. Okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not just .NET, but the facility to use it is built.
Okay. Cool. That's answered a lot of questions for me.
Okay, so yeah, so notice the use of the .default. Again, it's going to the portal to get the permission request, and then it, again, acquire token for client. So there's a bunch of different methods off of these types to say what flow I'm going to use. In this case, acquire token for client is say, use the client credentials flow, right? So that's an example. This is a relatively simple one that we can use. And again, you're building an API, you're building a timer job. These are the kinds of places where you're generally going to use this. I have tons and tons of utility applications I use to, like, you know, move stuff out of here in SharePoint or clean up stuff or whatever that uses this flow, right? They're just like little one-off applications. Have them used all over the place, right? So it's very common process to use. Oops, do that. Okay, so the on behalf of flow. So this is pretty much, well, the most commonly used in APIs, right? So you have some sort of API that you want to do something with another API on behalf of a user, right? So let's say, for example, I'm doing like expense reports or something like that. So I don't want to have a ton of business logic in my front end application that knows all the different places I'm going to go to. Like I'm going to go to, you know, wherever my expenses are reported. I'm looking through my email to see if I can find receipts, like a whole bunch of different things, right? I want to have that business logic centralized in an API. But maybe at the end of doing all of that stuff, some of the things which the current user may not have permissions to do, then I want to write a report out to their OneDrive. Okay, so that last bit, I want to do that as them using their permissions, right? Instead of me just having like some overarching permission to write to anybody's OneDrive and the whole tenant, right? I don't want to overscope the permission request. So this is where the on behalf of flow is a perfect example of what to use. Okay. So in this flow, the user is going to sign into whatever front end application they're using, website, a desktop app, whatever it happens to be, mobile client, right? So they're going to authenticate with app registration A, we'll call it, right? The front end app registration. They're going to authenticate in the app registration, like, and it will give permissions to do whatever the front end stuff like needs to do. And generally, it's just like, all we really need to know, are you a valid user in the tenant? Quite often, that's really all you need. Okay. But then the user wants to make a call to my API. So the API will have a separate app registration that it uses, right? So what the user can do is they're going to make a call to the API. The API is going to take their token, which identifies who the caller was, right? Who the user that got the token was. And then it's going to exchange that with some downstream API or some other API within the Microsoft 365 world that, and they're going to say, here, I want to take this token and I want you to give me a new token that I can use to call OneDrive, right? So the front end doesn't have any rights to call OneDrive, but the API does, right? So it takes the original token which the user used to authenticate with the API, and it exchanges that to get another token that actually has permissions to write to OneDrive. Okay. So there was a question earlier, is there ever a scenario where you use both application and delegated permissions? This is an example of that, right? So the permissions you request on behalf of the user are delegated permissions because you're using their identity and using their permissions. But the permissions to do other stuff, like access to ERP or whatever it happens to be, that might use application permissions. Okay, so this is a scenario where you might use both in the API itself. Now, you had questions about the on behalf. Did that clear up the questions, or do they still exist?
I think so.
Okay.
My only concern was that I was just viewing it as a potential vulnerability, and I was curious how it was validating what it had access to act on behalf of, and whether or not that list was like hard coded or dynamic.
Oh, it works exactly the same as what I've already shown you, right? So there's a set of permission requests. Those permission requests have to be granted, right? When you're talking about like an API, it's generally going to be an admin who grants the permissions. But and in the case of the on behalf of piece, you're using the user's identity and their permissions. So we're in the scenario where the app has to be granted permission to do something, and the user has to have permissions to do that same thing, or it won't work. You're not, in this case, the only time you're elevating permissions, you're allowing a user to do something they normally wouldn't be able to, is if you're using application permissions, because then the user permissions aren't considered, right?
Okay, so the part that's frying my brain there is when you're saying that it can't get permissions that it doesn't already have, but if it can't get permissions on that it doesn't already have, then what's the point of the mechanism of the on behalf of another
So
user? Because isn't the core principle of that to have the restricted access for the on behalf to get the elevated permissions?
No, the on behalf of is exactly the opposite. It's trying to only allow the current user.
So it's limiting the scope.
It's to the user, yeah. So when you're acting on behalf of the user, right? When you're using this flow, it's not, the whole idea is to not elevate permissions. It's to not give them access to anything that they normally wouldn't be able to do.
Yeah, so for example, say you're coming to me as yourself, right? And I have access to an ERP that you don't have access to. So you're asking me to do a bunch of stuff. I'm using my tokens that have access to the ERP to go do stuff, bring that back. And now I want to put this file into your OneDrive, to Rob's point. I don't have access to your OneDrive, but you do. So now I'm using on behalf of you to put it into your OneDrive.
Yeah, so the alternative would be to say that application, let it write to anybody's OneDrive, right? That would solve the problem. But now you're over permissioning, right?
Right.
Because it doesn't need to access, it just only needs to access the current user.
I understand the usefulness.
Yeah.
No, I totally get that. I'm just more concerned about the attack surface that potentially exists. So, for example, in the scenario that Dimitri just laid out, my question is, what's the mechanism to validate that application, that ERP application, has the rights to act on my behalf?
So those are two separate permissions, right? So the API that Dimitri's talking about would have to have whatever the ERP, whatever authentication and authorization mechanism they have to say, yes, this API can go access that information. And then separately, it would have a delegated permission, which is right to my OneDrive.
Okay.
So I'm not giving you access to the ERP. I'm just
right. Yeah, no, I understood that part, but I was just, okay. Yeah. I get it now. I understand.
Yeah. Okay.
That's complicated.
It is complicated, and that's why I have a demo that shows this, but you're right. There's a lot of moving pieces, and to try to understand all of them is a little bit difficult, right? But you should be aware of the flow, and if you have an opportunity to use it, then it will become, oh, this is like once you do it, once you'll get it, right? But you're right. It is not a simple flow to understand. There's two app registrations, the token exchange piece, all that stuff. There's a lot of moving pieces to using the OBO flow.
Okay.
but it's a very valuable flow.
Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, but when used on behalf of, it actually decreases the size of the footprint for attack because of the fact that, unlike you said, using like you can write to any OneDrive, it limits it to that one individual's OneDrive. Therefore, the footprint's minute comparatively.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to keep looking if I can figure out a way to make a simple demo that shows this. I don't think I'm going to be able to. I'll add it to my, there's no demo for this right now in the current downloads. I'm trying to figure out a way to simply demo it. I haven't been able to come up with an example. All right, token validation. So this is particularly valuable when you're getting a token from like a front-end application, whatever. You don't want to just assume the token is valid, right? There's a whole process involved in making sure that the token is actually a token that comes from an actual user or an actual application in, that is doing things for the right reasons, right? It's not trying to attack or malicious, right? So I created this deck and then I ran it through, an AI to say, can you validate this for me? And it said, you should not say should here. You should say always, or, and I was like, all right, you know what? You got me kind of, but it is something. I have written services that don't do token validation. I really should have, but it is something really, honestly, you should do. So there's a whole set of, there's libraries that do this, right? But again, just making sure that that someone's not trying to attack you, right? And spoof. So you should be validating your tokens. There's more information on exactly how to handle this. And the final thing, and this sort of relates back to the OBO flow. So it's exposing an API, and this generally is going to be in a scenario where you have multiple app registrations working together, or sometimes you're building a custom API, you're going to use this as well. So let me show you where it comes into play. So in the Entra portal, right, in an app registration, you can go down to expose an API. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to create a unique identifier for the API, right? So by default, it's API : whack and then the client ID. Okay? Most people just use that. When you have tons of these, quite often you'll see people change it to some like text, the GUI to some text value. It just has to be unique within your tenant. Okay. So you're going to create an application ID, and then you can create either custom permission scopes if you're doing delegated permissions, or roles if you're doing application permissions. Okay. So I can go in and create a scope, and a very, very common one you'll see is the scope name is access _as_user, access as user. You'll see that all over the place. And if you create like an Azure function and you do easy auth in that portal, this is exactly what it's going to create for you, right? So this is, but you can do other scopes, like for example, I'm building an expense reporting thing, like expenses.read, expenses.write, expenses.read-write, these could be the custom permissions you're creating, but you do this over here under add a scope. So in the OBO flow I talked about, right, you'll have the front end app registration, and then you'll grant it permissions to use your API registration. Actually, I think I have this. Hold on. So let me just go to API permissions. This is client. You know what? Let me just switch the app registrations here. Yeah, let's do this auth code one. And I'll go to API permissions. So add a permission. Instead of using one of these, I'm going to go to APIs my organization uses, and I'll go to API demo. So this app registration has all that stuff configured. So you can see the app ID, right? So it's the API again, and then the client ID. And I'm going to say I want to use delegated permissions. And then what's the permission I'm going to ask for? Access as user, right? So now this allows me to do the OBO flow, right? I can use the token that I get on the front end and give that to the API, and then I can go and exchange that for whatever the API has permissions to. So this is 935, right? So if I come over here, actually, let me just do it this way. App registrations, and then open a new tab.
I like the fact that it had application permissions grayed out because it only can go by delegated.
935. Oh. It was API, yeah, it was API demo. 9.3A5, that's what I missed, the A. Right, so API permissions. So you can see this one, right? So sites.readAll, application, right? Sites.readAll. Now, it's unfortunate that those scopes are named the same, but it is delegated, right? So this application can use this permission to read information from any SharePoint site, right? It's an application permission. It's not restricted in any way by who the user is. But it can also do the same thing on behalf of a user, the delegated permission, right? And then that when that user tries to do this, it will only show the sites that that user can access. It won't show all of them, right? So again, this is the setup I had for the OBO flow. But so like I said, there's a lot of moving pieces to this, but this is an example where we have both delegated and application permissions used in the same app registration. Okay, so I realize it's complex. It does take a little bit to get through that one, but it is a very, very valuable flow. And exposing the API is something that's commonly used when you do that. All right, and so finally, some resources, right? So the identity platform documentation, the implement user authentication and authorization. This is a learning path in Microsoft Learn. So this is training here, right? So this is docs, this is training, and there's a bunch of different code examples you can get from the link here. And then, of course, there's tons and tons of other resources out there. Obviously, I'm not going to have 1,000 resources on the slide, but these are the super important. Yeah.
I don't know. 2 questions for you. Can you touch on the difference between enterprise apps and app registrations?
So enterprise apps are where you see the service principals. So remember I talked about how the app registration defines or configures the app. Once you're using it, then you use a service principal and you get that through the enterprise applications. Okay. So the service principal represents your tenant's use of that app registration. In a single tenant scenario, there's one of each. But if you're doing multiple tenants, then your tenant the defining tenant, whatever tenant created the app registration, that's where the app registration lives. And then every tenant that consumes it will have a service principal, which is accessed through enterprise apps for that. So it's a one-to-many.
Got it. Thank you. And one more question. So I haven't been this in the weeds of things since I was doing SAML claims development years and years ago. And with SAML, the actual claim set would be signed by the service, the identity provider.
Yeah.
Here, everything looks like it's in plain text, besides the SSL certificate and so forth. But it's
encoded, but it's not. You can decode it. Yeah.
I think it's base 64 or something. But I guess my question is, if you did certificate based instead of client secret, would that also then encrypt the actual?
No, that doesn't change that. No, that only changes how you use the secrets.
Okay.
So this is a little bit beyond like my understanding, but I know that there is cryptography involved. Like one of the things you can do. Hold on, do I have this in an app demo or not? One sec. This would probably be in the OBO demo. Yeah, so part of the ability, like the thing here is the signing keys, right? So you can go get the signing keys, and this is part of the token validation process, right? So that's all built in. The specifics of it, I can't speak to super educated, but I know that it's not just this stuff is all plain text, and it's, you know, that's all part of the whole process of doing validation of your token. So that's why it's important to do the token validation.
Okay, that's a good point. Validation.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No worries. Any other questions? Anything from online? Or are we?
What's STS stand for?
Secure token server.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Yeah. So again, so it's really, there's two types of tokens. There's V1 and V2 tokens.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I didn't talk about but is important, again, this is a little bit more advanced, right? But still, it's worth knowing, is all this stuff is just an editor around a manifest, right? This is all represented by a manifest. And of course, now to make it more complicated, there's two kinds of manifests. But so one of the things here is, where is it? Access token accepted version. So null or V1 is a V1 token, V2 is a V2 token. So if you're doing V1, it's sts.microsoft.com. If you're doing V2, it's login.microsoft.com, right? So this says these are both valid shapes for the issuer.
Okay.
Right?
Gotcha.
If you only wanted to accept V2 tokens, then you would remove the STS one, right? And this would say, if you give me a V1 token, I'm not accepting it, right?
I was trying to figure out why the URL of sts.windows.net like teleported me back like 15 years.
It should.
All of a sudden, and I'm like, I know that URL, and I can't figure out why.
WS Federation.
I didn't want to tell you, but this is actually a time machine. So when you go outside your car from
Great.
You'll be 15 years younger. So that's, you know.
Back to driving my Durango. Awesome.
Any final things? No, awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's always, for those of you who don't know, I used to work in this area. So coming back here always feels like old home. So it's really great.
Great to have you.
Thank you.
Great to have you.
So we have a few slides just to close out the event for today. So we are continuing throughout the summer. We are working on securing the upcoming speakers. But that being said, we will be here as well as online. So for those that weren't able to join us in person today, feel free to come visit us next month in June. We do have a call for speakers. So if you know anyone that would like to speak, or if you'd like to speak yourself, please please let us know. In terms of upcoming community events, so the Microsoft 365 Community Conference down in Orlando just concluded fairly recently. The next event in this area is going to be Collab Days New England this upcoming October. It's on a Friday this year, just like it was last year, which is great because we're not asking people to give up a whole Saturday, and a lot of companies consider this training time. It's a free event. It's great. I'll be speaking, Rob. I'm sure you'll be there.
I submitted, yeah, hopefully.
I submitted.
Yeah. I guess I shouldn't say I'll be speaking because I submitted as well, but they tend to pick the local speakers. The Power Platform Community Conference is going back to Vegas this October. This is a paid event, and it's called the Power Platform Conference for now, but really the major focus is going to be Copilot Studio and all of those related low-code, no-code solutions. And then, of course, the big Microsoft flagship event of the year, Microsoft Ignite. It's going to be November 17th in San Francisco. It's paid if you want to go in person, but it's also free if you want to attend online. So for those that can't make it, you can sign up for sessions, add a bunch of things into your virtual backpacks, and then never go back and watch it. All right. There's a number of online communities as well. If you go to pnp.github.io, you'll have access to sign up and attend all of these. Plus, I'm sure there's probably more by this point. There are a few additional recurring community resources. Of
course, these slides will be available on our website, so don't feel like you have to screenshot it. We do have other area user groups, including the Rhode Island user group, the Granite State user group, a couple of Azure user groups, as well as a Power Apps user group. So a lot more learning available in the area. Next step here, is anyone running into a problem or solved something really complicated that you'd like to share and get some free consulting from the community? I'll share a really one bizarre thing. We're having this is a current problem in one of our client tenants. If you go to office.com or try to navigate to the Copilot home landing page, it redirects you to a landing page V2 that throws a server error.
Yeah, 404.
503.
Oh, the 503.
Yeah.
Oh, you guys did that one.
And apparently this is like a known issue that the product group is currently working on. And they already have the list of tenants that it impacts. It's been like
Is it
this.
something you're trying to flight that isn't ready yet? Is that what the issue is?
Probably.
Yes.
They've been updating that landing page a lot.
They pushed something out that broke it, and it's been broken for 2 weeks now.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's been bad.
That's how often I go to office.com.
Yeah.
Well, no, I'm just saying, like, I just don't normally go to that.
And the bizarre,
No slag on it. It's just I just don't normally navigate.
but again, this is one tenant out of over 100 that we manage, so it's not widespread.
Oh, so it's not okay.
Yeah,
It's
Yeah.
Not everybody.
it's a limited set of tenants.
Not global.
Yeah, it worked in my tenant. It's working.
And if you Google landing page V2, there's like one thing on the entire internet about this, and this was from like 3 years ago on some Microsoft forum that one person had a problem with, that a support ticket resolved. So just really bizarre behavior out there. But I feel like every time I go to the office homepage, they've moved stuff around.
Oh,
Yeah, and that's the problem.
It's
been nightmare fuel because it's like really bad.
It's too many clicks now to go find some app.
yeah,
Exactly.
and then you click on the waffle and the apps aren't there anymore, so you have to click more apps.
Exactly.
Like 3 clicks to get to the admin center.
Yeah.
It's definitely
Messing
a
with
pain
the
point.
waffle is maddening.
It's a pain
That was
point.
my
I
bypass.
understand how they're trying to spotlight Copilot, but completely blindsiding all the applications where it's brought Microsoft to where it is kind of weird, to be honest.
Agreed.
And the two focus on Copilot.
I've got one.
Yeah, go ahead.
When I renewed my license for the dial-up service, which I have had for years and years, they made a change where you now have to sign up for consumption credits, consumption communication in the pay-as-you-go system. In the off chance that you use beyond what's included in the plan, it'll kick over to this other plan, supposedly. I have never in the years that I have had this service come even close to kicking over, but I have to sign up for this thing anyways. That's fine, except it can't be activated on my tenant. It literally, I have the interface to go there to say enable pay-as-you-go services, and you click on it and it says failed to activate.
So
Again.
what I'll say is formally you would have communication credits where you would put like $20 or what have you in that, and it
But you have to toggle this switch in order to authorize it to put that $20 on there.
But again, so Microsoft's moving away from communication credits. They're going to billing for minutes in general. It has to be tied back to an Azure subscription. Do you have an Azure subscription in the Senate?
Sure. Yeah.
That'd be a good question for support then.
No, since October.
Do you have a support ticket open with them?
Yep.
Do you have your licenses direct through Microsoft or through a CSP?
Direct through Microsoft.
That is a bizarre one.
Yeah.
Your tenant is so old.
Mm-hmm.
That's the start of a joke, isn't it? How old is it?
It's so old. It was ran on a Commodore 64.
So one more thing to remind everyone, the Microsoft is raising prices on most of the base SKUs come July 1st. the kind of silver lining of this is that they've also recently released 3-year commitment licenses. So you're able to lock in essentially today's price for 3 years before the increase.
Sure. And there's not going to be another operating system after Windows 10, too.
Listen, E9 is just around the corner.
And E5 is going to be the mega of all time.
All right, let's keep this on track. So we want to thank all of our former sponsors. We have had, of course, a lot more sponsors over the years. Unfortunately, not all of them have survived or they were required. So this is the current batch that is still
There's
with
that
us.
little one in the bottom row, though.
Which one?
That little one. The bottom row.
Oh, Mike's company, Walt History Consulting, is in that bottom row. All right, so we're gonna stop the recording at this stage, just to allow free conversation.